Hello and welcome to Trojan Vision One-on-One, where we get to know the people who make Troy University such a special place. I am your host, Stephanie East, and joining me now is Will Jacks, a professor of art and photography in the Department of Art and Design here at Troy University in the College of Communication and Fine Arts, and we're so excited to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. I appreciate you inviting me to do this.
Well, thanks for being here.
Sure.
So, Will, before we get into what you do here at Troy, tell us a little bit about your background.
Oh gosh, how long do we have?
Talk as long as you would like.
I'm originally from Mississippi. It's where I lived before I came to Troy. From a little town in northwest Mississippi. It's a region called the Mississippi Delta. It's known for blues music, lots of civil rights history there as well, similar to the Alabama Black Belt. About 100 miles south of Memphis. And so I grew up in a little town there, similar to Troy, small university that was a teacher's college for years before it became a university. And then from there I did undergrad in Jackson, Mississippi at a small liberal arts college, and then journalism grad school at the University of Mississippi, and then went back to art school in my 40s and finished that a couple of years before I came here. And then in between, just worked for myself as a freelance photographer mostly. A little bit of design work that kind of came as a natural extension to the photographic work. And did that for almost 20 years before easing into higher ed.
Well, there's so much about what you just said that I want to talk about, but let's start with photography and how that became a passion of yours. Were you a kid running around with a camera?
I was not. I was always interested in art and creativity. I probably couldn't articulate it very well, but I was always making stuff and writing stuff and doodling and all of those things. And I had some formal art classes in high school, but I was mostly interested in baseball and football. And when I wound up in journalism grad school at the University of Mississippi, one of my duties, I took a job as a TA, and so one of my duties was to work with the yearbook and make sure we had the photographs for the book. And I'd not really worked with cameras at all up to that point, so I was probably 23 or so, 24 at this time. And part of what came with that is I was in charge of our press passes. So I was in charge of making sure we had a photographer at the ball games, or we had a photographer in the green room when there was a theatrical event, or backstage when we had big public speakers on campus. And it was that part that I fell in love with, this aspect of being able to kind of see beneath the theater of the world and be behind the scenes or on the sidelines or just anywhere that most people don't get to enjoy. And I really enjoyed fell in love with that part of the world, and the camera was kind of an extension to be able to experience the world in that way. And it was also a tool that creatively made sense to me. The math of it all made sense in my brain, and I'd tried painting and ceramics and I was not very good at any of it, and music, I was terrible at all of it, but the camera was the first creative tool that ever just felt right, that what I had in my head I could kind of translate through that tool. And so that combination of the craft making sense to me, but mostly this access to a whole amazing world is what drew me to it.
Well, and you mentioned that you have a journalism background as well, and how does that merge together with what you do? I mean, I guess it is telling stories in a certain way.
A lot of my work, especially earlier work, I'd say could easily be identified or described as journalistic documentary. I did a lot of editorial work, a lot of freelance things for publications all over the country, all over the world, when they'd need something in Mississippi. And so that side of that part of my photography is very much grounded in observing the real world, and translating that, communicating that in some way. My work now has started to move into some more abstract spaces that I do in the studio, but I still consider it to be documentary work. It's all based off of real experiences, real people, real places. I'm just choosing some different ways to use the medium to convey those messages.
Well, speaking of telling stories, one of the things that you have done is a show about a juke joint in Mississippi.
I did, yeah.
Called Po Monkey's Lounge, and it tells the story of that lounge. So tell us a little bit about that project.
So in Mississippi, probably around the year 2000 or so. So I mentioned earlier where I grew up in the Mississippi Delta is very much known for its musical history. B.B. King, John Lee Hooker, Ike Turner. The list just goes on and on and on of famous musicians, particularly blues, that are from that area. And with that has come a lot of interest from people outside the Delta to kind of trace musical history, especially Europeans, because we as Americans were kind of given back this blues music through rock and roll, primarily through bands like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. And so in the 80s and 90s in particular, the Mississippi Delta started to see kind of this informal tourism industry that was kind of emerged, but nobody really knew that it emerged because the blues, honestly, in Mississippi was kind of taken for granted. It was just, another thing that happened there. And so around the year 2000, the Mississippi state government formally established a Mississippi Blues Commission with the intention of supporting that culture, recognizing that culture, developing more of it, but also working towards a tourism economy around it. And that came with its own kind of pros and cons as well. And this juke joint, Po Monkey's, was one of the spots that was kind of celebrated as like, this is, if you're going to come to Mississippi and experience the real Mississippi, you have to go to a juke joint. And this was one of the places that was really elevated as like, you have to go here. So there were lots of people from all over the world that would show up at this tiny little place out in the middle of nowhere, in an old tenant farmer's house, and on the edge of a cotton field, like all of the stereotypical romanticized Southern kind of tropes were all kind of baked into this. And so I began to become curious of like, why are people so attracted to this? And then also, what does it mean to those of us that were raised in this area who kind of were a little oblivious to a lot of it? And so I started going. It was open every Thursday night, so I'd go most Thursdays and just take my camera with me, and started with an assignment for a magazine. I spent about 9 months on it, delivered the content for that, but it didn't feel finished. I didn't feel like I'd done anything worthwhile, and so I just kept going back and going back and going back and going back. And eventually the proprietor, Willie Seabury, whose nickname, all of his brothers and dad had animal nicknames. His dad was Rabbit. He had a brother that was Teddy, and so they called him Bear. And so Willie's nickname was Monkey, and he added the moniker Po Monkey as kind of an all shucks thing that helped to create interest in this space. And so I did that for about 10 years. Wow. And in 2016, Willie passed away. I'd had a book contract that the deadline was in 2013, and I kept saying, it's not ready, it's not ready, it's not ready. And then Willie passed away, and that really kind of changed things. And there were a lot of legal issues over who was declared to be his heirs and who actually owned the property and who didn't, and just a whole slew of things at that point that were very much connected to the Mississippi Delta's agricultural history and the problems baked into that. And so the book is certainly on the surface, it's this 10-year documentation of this space, but it's also an examination of cultural tourism and the complexities of what happens when we begin to kind of package our past and try to sell it to build a future. And those are all things that kind of came out of that research and that project.
That is so interesting. And the name of the book is?
It's Po Monkey's, and then with the subtitle Portrait of a Juke Joint.
And I imagine if you spent so much time there, you had to have formed a deep relationship with the people who work there and go there.
I would say yes, but then I also would say no. Like I knew Willie well enough. He was quite aware of what I was doing, and I've got not just photographs, but lots of interviews, audio and video interviews with him as well. And so he knew my curiosity, and they knew me as, like most people would call me, picture man or picture guy when I went out there. And most weeks I would make photographs, and then I'd go home on Friday and I'd take them to Walgreens and I'd make 3.5 by 5 prints of everything. And then the next week I'd carry the prints out. And if the people in the photographs were there that week, we'd just give them the photographs. And if they weren't, they'd get stapled to the walls. And so the walls of this space were filled with old photographs and all types of other posters and paraphernalia like that. And so my photographs kind of became part of the vernacular construction of this place as well. And so there are still some folks that I keep in touch with. I knew Willie well enough to know that I didn't know him as well as lots of other people. But he was very good at making people feel like he was their best friend. And so I knew when he was doing that to someone else. And so I kind of chuckle when I hear people talk about how close they were to Willie, because I'm kind of like, you weren't close. I was not. We weren't best friends by any stretch of the imagination. But we had kind of a relationship in the sense of he knew that there was something about his world that I was interested in and that he could teach me. And I knew that he was interested in sharing that.
I love what you said about being curious, because that's something I try to tell my students about storytelling and journalism is curiosity. You have to want to know things and tell stories.
Yeah, and it was a project too. I mean, it was in my own backyard, and I'd done assignments in various capacities for other publications where I'd go somewhere else, and it's somebody else's home and somebody else's community, and so you do your best to extract the information that is relevant to whatever it is that you're trying to convey. But it's a really different when it's your own community, your own friends that you're looking at as honestly as possible and trying to learn something. And there were aspects of it that were incredibly uncomfortable for me, but also aspects that were very eye-opening. And so it taught me a lot about the aspects of my own home that I thought I knew better than any place on the earth. And then you realize how much you don't know about the place that you think is most intimate to you.
And one thing I like about your work is not only Mississippi, but all of the South. You really have a deep connection, and you're trying to tell stories all across the South.
Yeah, I think so. At one point I would have really embraced the idea of being a Southern photographer, and it's not that I reject it now, but Southern photography in the photo world is definitely a thing. And there's kind of a melancholy generally to it, a nostalgic approach to it that a lot of photographers have. And so what I've learned over the years is that I don't really have to try as hard anymore for the South to be a part of my work, that it's gonna be in there whether I want it to be or not, that all of that aspect of my own life in rural Mississippi, and now actually, Troy does not feel rural to me at all. It feels quite metropolis because my town is so much smaller. But I think a lot of other people would probably say we live in a rural area. But that aspect of just what I have encountered in my life is it's going to be in the work.
Well, we've talked a little bit about your documentary type work, but also I read online that something described your pictures as photography that pushes boundaries. What do you think about that?
I like the sound of that. That's probably in regard to some new work that I'm making that's using traditional photographic materials like black and white paper and chemicals, so tools that we would use in the darkroom. To make prints, but I am choosing different ways to apply the chemicals to the material. So there's a very painterly-like quality to it, a drawing-like quality. I'm making a lot of this new work thinking about structures that are connected to rural South, homes and barns and churches, and just kind of the very geometric shapes that usually make up those spaces. And so the work in that regard to me is very documentary. It's kind of like mining my own memory and whatever has kind of been burnt into my vision of, like, when I see the South, what does it look like in here? And so that's a form of documentation that I'm increasingly, a more conceptual form that I'm exploring a lot. And then the way that I create the prints technically uses all of the aspects of photography, light and chemicals and time, all of those things, but physically doesn't necessarily look like that. And so I'm also really exploring the ideas of labels and how we choose to define something based in certain ways. But you know, so it's made up of all the photographic parts, but it doesn't look like a photograph. So is it a photograph? Is it not? I'm not sure, but that's part of what I'm enjoying exploring right now.
Well, you've had several exhibits over the last few years. Walk us through some of those that you've had across Alabama and across the South.
Alabama's been it's been a wonderful move for me in a number of ways, and certainly the artistic community has been incredibly welcoming to me. I've had work in the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art, work at the Ogden Museum, which is in New Orleans. I had solo exhibition this past year in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama, another in Birmingham at the main branch of the public library there. The Wiregrass Museum. Where else have I been around here? Drawing a blank now. That's like the last 2 years. The Alabama State Council on the Arts awarded me one of their 12 visual arts fellowships this past year, which was also incredibly humbling, especially only being my third year in Alabama. So yeah, it's been great.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about too, was about the grant. So how exciting was that? And tell us a little bit about how you were awarded it and what you did.
Well, the Alabama State Council on the Arts is an extension of the National Endowment of the Arts. Every state has some form of that outlet. And then that organization can use their allotment of NEA money however they deem fit. Most states are pretty similar in how they do it. And so one of the things that the state of Alabama does is it awards visual and literary and performance art fellowships. So there are 20 or so artists, writers, performers that they award these fellowships to every year. It's a $5,000 fellowship, and there will be an exhibition at the end of this cycle. So it'll be like next fall that the visual artists will come together for that. And the application process is generally a fairly standard one. You submit the work or examples of your work, and then some written elements, which is also something that I have to tell my students a lot, especially in the visual arts. They're like, why do we have to write so much? It's because that is one of the aspects to this career path, but it's also one of the aspects to understanding your own work, being able to articulate it, so you put words to it, and it all, you know, gets less out of here and kind of more into the world. And so that process was one of a couple of essays and some examples of my work.
Well, when you are about to get an exhibit together, take us through the process from beginning to end. What is that like?
You know, I think that's something that's one of the most important things for all artists to learn is what their process is. And it's taken me years to kind of start to understand how I work best. And deadlines are really valuable for me. But generally what I'll do, if it's not a body of work that I've already made, so sometimes the exhibitions are work that I've already made and someone else is showing that work, that it kind of usually will go through a cycle of several exhibitions before I kind of retire it. But if it's a new body of work, it usually starts with space. So I get an idea of like, well, where is this going to be seen? What's the space look like? What's the best way? Should I make really big things? Should I make little things? Do I need to take into consideration the middle of a room, or is it all going to be on the walls on the edge of the room? So I'll often start with that, and I do like to make work that is specific to a space. And then I'll go back through my journals. I usually keep a little notebook in my back pocket or in my jacket pocket, and I'm constantly writing down thoughts so that I don't lose them. And then I'll go back to that journal periodically, so on my studio days, which I try to have for at least once a week. Sometimes it's every other week. And it's not always making. Sometimes it's just going back through my notes, through my organization, and kind of what have I been thinking about, like what keeps popping up. And so I'll start to formalize that, and I'll write a little bit about it. And then from there, images start to emerge from the words. And then when I sit down to make, ideally I'll have about a week or so, a week to 2 weeks to kind of experiment. I'll say, I've got the space now, I know the scale that I want to work, here's some language that keeps popping up in my thoughts, and now I'm going to sit down and I'm going to use this material at this scale and with these ideas. And so I'll start making and kind of playing in the studio and make a lot of bad stuff, but inevitably every day I'll leave my studio when something excites me. Sometimes that takes 2 or 3 hours, sometimes it takes 10 or 12, but it's either an idea or a process that I'm excited about. And so I'll say that's where I stop, and then when I come in the next day I pick up with that idea, and I'll carry that through with experimentation and play until I kind of get away from that idea and into a new one, and then something excites me, and so I'm layering my ideas that way. And then after about a week or two, I'm able to narrow that play down. I've got work that I can look at and say, I like the way this looks, I don't like that or that. And so I can put the work that I like over here and begin to recognize patterns in it. And then that becomes the body of work. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to narrow it down to this shape, this pattern, this color, this tone, whatever it is. And I'm just going to make as many iterations of that as I can. And I'm going to make it at scale for the space that it needs to go into.
That is so interesting. Do you have a favorite exhibition that you have done that sticks out to you? Or do you like all
really,
of them?
I would say that almost as soon as I put new work up, I'm ready to move to something else. And because it's really about problem solving. I'm ready to solve another problem. And so sometimes I may kind of dismiss work a little faster than I should. Storage becomes an issue, like where do I keep everything? But I wouldn't say there's any one favorite. I mean, everything that I've ever done is like the best I could do in that moment. And so that in and of itself is kind of rewarding to know. There's certainly old work that I look at and I'm kind of like, ooh. But I also know that that's the best I could do at that time.
Yeah, I understand. There's some, when I started out in journalism, I watch some stories now and think, oh, I could have done that better. What led you to teaching though? So you have this passion. What led you to want to teach a new generation of students?
I was always interested in teaching. I was always doing it in one way or another. My first year out of undergrad, my undergraduate degree was in Spanish, and I wound up teaching 7th and 8th grade English at a small school in North Mississippi, not far from Oxford. And I enjoyed that a lot. But it was one year, I was 21, 22 years old, and then I went back to grad school for journalism. But even when I was freelancing, I was always doing workshops or making my own workshops. There was always something that I enjoyed with it. And around 2013 or 14, maybe 12, somewhere in there, I had gone back to Ole Miss to finish up my journalism degree because I did everything but my thesis when I was there the first time. And then I went back, and that actually led to me adjuncting, teaching a photojournalism class for the school. 3 days before that first semester that I was going to teach at Ole Miss started, Delta State's photo professor had to take a sabbatical, and so I wound up taking over 4 of his classes. So I went from never teaching to having 5 college courses plus all the freelance work that I was doing. And I continued to do that, to work for both schools and freelance for about another 5 or 6 years. And the energy of the classroom was something I really loved. It forced me to constantly be researching myself and to find new ideas to share with my students. And then the students are constantly asking questions or doing things that's like, oh, that's a great idea. I love that. And so this exchange of ideas was something, especially in higher ed, that I really fell in love with. And then I also recognize that there are aspects of this job that are healthy for me. There's structure, but not quite the same as like 8 to 5. Behind a desk all day long. I have duties that I have to do, but I also have some of the freedom to kind of move around and make sure they get done. It's not completely wide open, so I do have to be at my office pretty regular. That's very healthy for me too. And being around other people. When I was freelancing, I was by myself a lot. And just having this environment or having an office space with colleagues to share ideas is really healthy for me and something I enjoy. And so it was something I think was always there for me, but it took some serendipity for it to kind of fall in my lap. And then it took me another 5 or 6 years to kind of figure out what I was doing.
Well, what made Troy specifically a place you wanted to come to?
There's an aspect of Troy that feels very familiar to me and comfortable. And I knew Troy from athletic days of its old Gulf South Conference days at Troy and Delta State University, where I worked in Mississippi, in my hometown, were athletic rivals. So I knew Troy. My vision of Troy was like this football powerhouse that was constantly winning national championships at the Division II level. And so I knew the school that way. I'd not spent much time down here. I bought a photo printer in probably 1999 or 2000 from somebody in Dothan. And that's the only time I'd ever been like in this part of the state. But there were a lot of aspects of kind of that teacher's college history, the town connection to the university, the scale of it was wonderful. The campus is beautiful. And all of that was very attractive to me and just felt really comfortable.
And what do you hope for, what do you hope the future of art and design here at Troy University is?
That's a good question. I hope that we are able to grow with the technology that's inevitable in our field, that we are able to create a sense of community, not just within our classrooms or our department or even this campus, but regionally wide, that we are able to help our students and our colleagues and our communities understand that art is not just decoration. When it's done really well, it's about problem solving, and it's about learning very pragmatic ways to connect otherwise random dots so that you come up with new solutions to common materials, and that skill set can be applied regardless of whether or not you want to make work for the Museum of Modern Art, or you want to go work for an engineering firm, or you want to have an administrative job in management somewhere. We're all solving problems, and we all generally have to solve problems with the materials that we have at hand. And the thought of just kind of starting over all the time from scratch is great, but it's also not like the real world. And so when we do our job well in the art department, that's what we're teaching. We just choose to teach it through visual materials, tactile materials, but it can be applied in a number of ways. And so I hope that we can grow, of course, that we, like I said, have the wisdom to move with the technology, and that we can create an environment of productive experimentation.
Well, Will, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's been so fun to talk to you. Thanks.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
And we'll see you next time here on Trojan Vision One-on-One.